Bueno, un lujo los speakers que vinieron hasta Buenos Aires con más de 10 horas de vuelo, así que muchas gracias a los tres. Y vamos a empezar con un profesional que admiramos mucho, y si dicen cómo hacemos en la Nación Data para aprender, miramos qué están haciendo en otros países, y estas personas que invitamos a venir acá las seguimos hace no meses, sino años, así que las queremos compartir con ustedes. Y el primero es Steve Doig, que él va a dar su keynote sobre la prehistoria de los datos hasta el nacimiento de Big Data. Estará a cargo, Steve es Knight Chair de la Knight Foundation, de periodismo, especializado en periodismo de datos en la escuela de Walter Cronkite de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona. Trabajó 23 años como periodista, incluyendo 19 años en el Miami Herald. Ganó el premio Pulitzer de Servicio Público en 1993 por un estudio de los patrones de daño del huracán Andrew, ¿sí? Con data. Ganó otros premios por investigaciones sobre políticas de inmigración de Estados Unidos, la criminalidad, el encarcelamiento en Florida o las prácticas de facturación sospechosas de hospitales de California. Sobre esto escribimos en el blog de Data de la Nación. Steve también es miembro activo de IRE, Investigative and Reporters and Editors, y fue miembro de la Junta Directiva de la organización, que nuclea más de 4.000 miembros durante 4 años. Así que bueno, Steve, fuerte aplauso. Fuerte aplauso.
Hola y buenos días. Unfortunately, I'm an American. I only speak English, and even that's not as good as some of you speak English, I know. I always apologize when I speak to audiences in other parts of the world because, again, I'm a very typical American who I'm always embarrassed when I go to other countries and meet so many people who do speak 2, 3, 4 languages perfectly, and I don't. I do know the important Spanish phrases like ¿Dónde está el baño? Let's see, más cerveza, por favor. I know that, but that's about it. So I apologize. I'll start off by thanking my translator, who is going to make what I say understandable to you. So I always appreciate what the translators do. I also really want to thank the data team and organizers and so on from La Nación, and the people in the communications school at Austral University, and also my American embassy for helping get me here. It's my first time in Buenos Aires, and I really look forward to this talk and to this visit. Let me just take this off here. Make sure I don't talk too long. Here we go. Okay, Flor, who invited me, told me that what she would like is some kind of talk that tells us how we got to where we are today. And the best way I can do that is by talking about my own path from knowing nothing about data journalism into becoming a literal graybeard of data journalism. And dinosaurs seem to be a good way to do that. And so this clearly is me. I'm a data dinosaur. I got started, literally in the ages of Stegosaurus and all that. I guess I would also say, as I talk about my own history in getting here, that I certainly had no vision of what I would be doing 40 years later. When I was in college, and I'll talk more about that, but I certainly did not go to college to become what I am today. It was basically a series of sort of good luck and interesting opportunities and things like that wound up appearing. So let me talk about that and kind of lead you to where data journalism kind of came from. One of the earliest things that happened, at least in our lifetime, or certainly my lifetime, I'm older than most of you here, was in 1952, the famous television broadcaster Walter Cronkite who actually is the person whose name is on my journalism school at Arizona State University. In 1952, Walter Cronkite, who's the man standing there holding the paper, did a TV broadcast about the election that was coming up and used a computer, and what you see in the background there is the computer, to talk about what the election polls were saying about who was going to win the election. As near as we can tell, at least in the United States, this was kind of the first instance of what I guess I would call computer-assisted reporting. When Simon talks to you, he'll show you actually a wonderful clip from 150 years earlier, 130 years earlier, in 1821, the Manchester Guardian had a front page story that actually did some data journalism, and he'll tell you about that. But at least in my lifetime, this is probably the first of those instances. Still very sporadic. Another checkpoint was in the mid-1960s in the United States, at the height of our civil rights disturbances, of the civil rights revolution that was going on. There were lots of riots and civil disturbances and so on. And a then young reporter at the Miami Herald named Phil Meyer started doing polling and did surveys of the communities that were living in the areas that were where the race riots were occurring, and began to use kind of social science techniques to help do better reporting. So that was going on again in the mid-1960s. At the same time, in the mid-1960s, I was getting ready to go to college. I was a young high school student, been a pretty good student, but pretty much an athlete, a jock. I certainly had no particular idea of what I wanted to be. I went off to a very good university, Dartmouth University, up in New Hampshire. Got there with the goal of being a doctor, I guess, except my freshman year, I had to take chemistry. And that persuaded me I wasn't going to be a doctor. I took calculus, freshman calculus, and got the gentleman's C-, I guess, in that. There was something interesting that happened in my calculus class, however. The professor of my calculus class had been the inventor of the computer language BASIC, which some of you may have heard about. John Kemeny he and one of his colleagues at Dartmouth created BASIC. So I remember nothing about calculus, but I do remember writing programs in BASIC. And I thought, gee, isn't that interesting? You know, this idea of being able to write sort of simple instructions and getting a machine to do what you want done, but still had no idea what I wanted to do with it. That calculus class was the last math I took. I never took any statistics. All those other things that I later wound up have spent my whole career trying to painfully teach myself, the things that I could have learned in a one-semester class but didn't. Sadly, my first couple of years at Dartmouth, instead of studying and going to class and so on, were largely devoted to beer and women. I had a wonderful couple of years. To the point of finally my grades were so bad that Dartmouth didn't want me anymore, but my Uncle Sam did want me. Back then the Vietnam War was going on, and back then the United States had a draft. And my draft number was low, and sort of the next thing I knew, I was standing in line. Can you hear okay? Oh, I'm good. Thank you. I was standing in line in the draft line, waiting to be, get my physical to go in the Army, and a recruiting sergeant was kind of going up and down the line, asking all of us who were standing there literally in our underwear, what was your last major? What did you study? My most recent major had been English, but I'd sort of bounced through 2 or 3 of them. And he said, well, you ought to sign up for an extra year. Instead of just being drafted for 2 years, if you enlist for 3 years, we'll send you to, someplace, a better thing than carrying a rifle in Vietnam. Well, that sounded good to me. And what they did was sent me to what they called the Defense Information School. So the Army is the one that started me on the path to becoming a reporter. I went to the Defense Information School. After I went through there, they promptly sent me to Vietnam. But instead of having to carry a rifle, I got to carry a pen and pencil and camera going around Vietnam. So I spent a year in Vietnam. It was very interesting. It persuaded me I didn't want to be a war correspondent. That was probably not fun, and I really admire the people who do that. But I did get to meet a lot of the war correspondents who were there covering the Saigon Press Corps. And it was actually while I was in Vietnam that sort of the light bulb went off on my head and said, gee, maybe when I get out of the Army I can be this journalist thing. That seemed to be an interesting profession. So really I owe it to the U.S. Army to having led me to what wound up to be a very interesting career. After I spent my time in the Army and as an instructor at the Defense Information School, had to get a job. I got my first job at a small paper in Florida, and then after a couple of years there, the Miami Herald hired me. And I wound up at the Herald covering a variety of different beats, very classic kind of general assignment kind of reporter, covering everything from nuclear power plants to criminal justice to the lottery, all those kinds of things that go on. One of the things about working for a paper like the Miami Herald is you had to have a kind of a special skill. You had to have something to make you stand out. I was in a newsroom that was filled with people who would go on to win Pulitzers at either the Herald or at other newspapers. The Herald was one of the sort of classic feeder places for the New York Times and the Washington Post. Reporters continually going through there and going on to great careers. So the way to stand out, the way to succeed in an environment like that was to have some skill, something you were better at than other people were. And I certainly wasn't a better writer than people like Barry Barak and so on who were there, who were wonderful writers. I was a pretty good investigator, but we had people who were just amazing at that. But it turned out that my special skill that I started developing was I could do percentage change. I knew enough math to be able to do that. And that actually became an incredible skill, because I would have people who would go on to win Pulitzers eventually coming up to me and saying, does the big number go on the top or the little number? That kind of thing. They had no idea what to do. So just by being able to do percentage change, I started being called professor in the newsroom years before I became one. So that became my special skill, this ability to be able to find stories in data. It started in 1981 when I was covering the state capitol, and I bought myself to play with at home an Atari 800, a computer like this. Some of you may have seen these in museums. Literally among the first thing. I purely bought it to play with it. One of the reasons why is the language that you could program in was BASIC. I still remembered my BASIC from 15 years or whatever it was earlier. Back then, this cost $2,000, which was real money back in 1981. I mean, that was a huge amount for something that had less power than the wristwatches that most of you are wearing right now. But it was great. So I started writing programs, playing around at home, and began to realize that actually I could use this thing to do stuff in covering the stories I had to cover. I also, at the time, ran into, sort of discovered Phil Meyer. Remember, the one who was doing the social science research back in the mid-'60s. Phil wrote a book called Precision Journalism. What a concept, what a contrast, the idea of precision and journalism together. But that was his idea. He was telling us that we needed to use social science methods to start making our reporting better. So I read that, and he had written this in 1972, and it was like 10 years too soon because we didn't have access to computers. Back then, the things he was talking about you could only do if you had access to like a big university mainframe. So anyway, I started learning other things you could do with a computer. I bought an early IBM computer, began playing with programs like VisiCalc, which was the first the first spreadsheet program, learned to do mapping, Lotus 1, 2, 3, Paradox, various other programs like that, and sort of piecing together the pieces, I guess, that would, it's almost like building a Frankenstein monster, a piece here, a piece there, as I learned to do different kinds of skills for different kinds of stories. What I discovered in doing this is, to me, the core of data journalism. We have forever in journalism, we have been telling stories by using anecdotes, finding an instance and using that to hang a story on. And the nice thing about data journalism is you can go beyond anecdote to actual evidence. And yet at the same time, the data journalism can help us find the best anecdotes. So if you can look over all the things, you can pull out something that really helps tell the story, you kind of doubled the power of it. And that's what I discovered, and that became kind of my secret power at the Miami Herald. I wound up having more and more reporters coming to me for help on their ideas for stories, and became basically a specialist in data journalism. One of my first big stories for the Herald doing a data journalism thing involved the 1990 census. And this will give an example of sort of how the power of this has kind of exploded. In late, I guess it was 1989, a story came out of Chicago. A group of academics had done a study using census data showing how racial segregation had changed in the United States over a 10-year period. The data they used was the 1970 census and the 1980 census. So 9 years after the 1980 census came out, their study was released talking about how racial segregation had changed in the United States. Well, I thought that was an interesting idea. I talked with my editors. I said, gee, I think we can do something like that. And I talked with other newspapers that were involved with the Knight Ridder newspaper chain, other Miami Herald partners, and wound up persuading them to buy all the census data that we needed. Wrote the programs in SAS. By the way, thank you, SAS, for your support here. To look at the changes between 1980 and 1990. Our story came out a month after the 1990 data was first released. So instead of waiting 9 years, we were able to, within a month, produce this story. That seems really fast now. One side note I will add, by the way, is when we came out with it, it turns out that USA Today newspaper was planning to do the same kind of story, and their consultant was Phil Meyer. And we beat them, so I was very happy about that. Yeah, Phil called me up and said, damn it, how'd you do that? So we did that. But one of the things I remember was in the, as we were writing the story about how the changes had occurred in segregation, we called up a demographer named, who was it, Bill, I've forgotten, Bill Fry, that's it, Bill Fry, in Chicago. And he had been actually one of the people involved in the study that came out of Chicago a couple of years earlier. Called up Bill and said, we've done this study, here's what we found. And there was this long silence, and then he said, my God, I had no idea newspapers could do this kind of thing. I mean, he was stunned. And what we had done basically was put the sociologists on notice that they weren't the only ones that played around with this kind of thing. So that study actually became very interesting. It showed how the segregation that was very strong had changed. It certainly hadn't gone away. There's still lots of segregation in the United States, but life was different. We were able to, again, go beyond anecdotes and actually use evidence to show that this had happened. So I wound up doing other kinds of data-related stories. We looked at criminal justice in South Florida, and the lead of our story was something like Miami has more crime and less punishment than any big city in the country. Again, based on evidence. We looked at problems of immigration. At the time in the 80s, there were waves of immigrants coming in from the Caribbean and certainly Cuba. We had the Mariel boat lift, where over the course of about a month, we had 100,000 extra people show up in Miami. that had to be housed and dealt with and so on. Society certainly was changing in South Florida. And again, to be able to use data to help tell these stories was very powerful. One of the stories that I would say probably has been copied by most of my data journalism colleagues at one time or another, and certainly probably was better read and better remembered than all of my big heavy ones, was when I got the dog license database for Miami, and did a story looking at what the most popular breeds of dogs and the names people use for their dogs. It turns out they're not very, people aren't very creative. There are hundreds of collies named Lassie, bulldogs named Winston, for Winston Churchill. Yet other odd ones, pit bulls named Fifi, and little tiny dogs named Killer. And then a few people had no idea what to name their dog, so they wound up naming their dog after themselves. That's like, come on, Steve. Hey, Steve, come on. Very strange. But anyway, it was wonderful. So I wrote this story, obviously well read. Everybody loves their dogs, and they were able to go through and look at all that stuff. And again, it's been done all over the place. The sort of the major checkpoint in kind of my career, and certainly a big thing in data journalism, was when Hurricane Andrew came through South Florida. In August of 1992. It damaged heavily or destroyed about 80,000 homes in South Florida in one dark and stormy night, and one of those homes was mine. And so when I came out in the morning, looking at my roof gone, my windows blown out, my family and I had spent the night huddled in our bathroom listening to all this stuff going on and so on. When I came out in the morning, I was pissed off. I was angry because for years in South Florida, we had been told we had the strongest, toughest building code in the nation because hurricanes came through there. But it had been about 20, 25 years since the last big hurricane went through. And as it turns out, as we discovered, changes had been made in the building code over this time. And this is what the areas that I was living in kind of looked like. Pretty much heavily damaged or destroyed. I mean, this is not a tornado. This is like tornado damage, except spread over hundreds of square miles. It was truly extraordinary. We wound up doing a study of the damage using a variety of databases. This particular project, I guess I would say, is an example of Louis Pasteur's remark that chance favors the prepared mind. And in this case, my mind had been prepared by doing other kinds of data stories. I'd done stories using the property tax roll, for instance, and I'd learned to use SAS, the programming language that helped me understand, be able to deal with big data sets and so on. So anyway, we were able to take the damage reports, match them up to the property tax roll, and find the pattern. And I found a pattern that actually became kind of the lead of our story. And it was the sort of the first really true smoking gun of my career. And that pattern was, the newer the home, the more likely to be destroyed. It was very clear in the data. Homes built in the 80s, heavily damaged. Homes built in the 70s, not so much. Homes built in the 60s, all did pretty well. Why could that be? Well, we did more research, more investigations, using data and other things, and basically discovered how the building code had been weakened over the years to the point then when finally the big one came through, and Hurricane Andrew was a big one, we wound up with this kind of damage. Well, that won the Pulitzer for the Herald, and I was proud to be part of that team. The project we did, this 18-page special section with maps and so on, was really good piece of work. And again, it's a good example comparing this to like later hurricanes, like Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans. There was amazing things that were done. So this ability that reporters have had to build on these earlier things. So comparing what I did here to what was done later, I mean, this really does look like dinosaurs did it because the later stuff is so much better. because of the increase in the power and the tools and things like that. I should go back, by the way, to mention the census thing. The census story that we did a month after, which was so fast that the social scientists were amazed. Now when the census comes out, that day, reporters have complete things already ready. The programs have been written and so on. So the timeline has sped up so much because the power of the computers and the reporters is so much better now. I finally, after doing all these kinds of stories with the Herald, I was offered a job at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. I'm very proud to be part of that, and certainly the man who certainly at the time didn't know, but he was actually doing one of those first steps in computer-assisted reporting. So I've worked there since 1996. One of the things I get to do is wander around and talk to people about the importance of data journalism. I train my students, and I still train other reporters. I talk a lot about precision journalism, this idea of using social science techniques. I call it social science done on deadline, basically, and that's really what we're doing with computer-assisted reporting. It's a matter of finding patterns in the data, and that's really what we're doing. And it's actually not extraordinarily hard. You don't need very exotic statistical techniques or things like that. Many of our best stories come out of just frequency tables, how many of each thing. The newer the home, the more likely to be destroyed was a simple frequency table. What was the percentage of homes destroyed built in each 5-year segment, basically, of the previous years. So turning a big jumble of records into something that has a pattern to it is really the power that we bring using this kind of data analysis. And finding that smoking gun is such a great feeling, particularly when the data is telling you the story, because then you're not kind of being misled by one person's particular viewpoint. What you're doing is looking at all of it. I should add that the reason this is possible, the thing that has made what we're doing today, and not only the kinds of stories that I was able to do at the Herald, and that other reporters were doing at other newspapers around the country. I mean, this idea of data journalism spread around the United States, and certainly over the years has spread incredibly around the world. I remember doing a talk at the BBC in London, and this is about, I guess it was around 15 years ago. Went to the BBC, they asked me to talk about this data journalism thing. So I had gotten some data on crime in London, on the 33 boroughs of London, and did a little map showing, the patterns of crime and so on. And I remember putting this map and the table up on the screen for the reporters to see, and their jaws open. They said, "My God, where did you get this? How did you sneak this out?" And I said, "Well, I sat in my office in Arizona. I went on the internet, looked up Scotland Yard. There it was." They didn't know. That was 15 years ago. And of course, today, amazing stuff is being done, led by The Guardian, for instance, showing the kind of information that is there. Same kind of thing is happening all over the world, including obviously here in Argentina. Amazing stuff that only a few years ago you wouldn't have even considered being able to do, and now is possible, again, because of the possibility of data being there. You are pushing here in Argentina the idea of open data, and I think that's an extraordinarily powerful thing, not only for journalists as an opportunity for finding stories, but it's really a powerful thing for society, because what it does is open up those possibilities of discovering, sort of how your society works, what parts don't work, and how we fix them. It gives you actual things to talk about. So freedom of information laws are a good thing to push for. One of the reasons I think the United States has had, an early start on doing this, reporters had an early start on it, is we have, in general, have had very strong freedom of information laws. Federal FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Here, I understand here in Argentina, it's more a freedom to ask for information. That's what you have, but you don't actually have a law compelling that they give it up. So But again, it's, there's more and more of it out there, and it's sometimes it's scary for public officials to realize when you ask for data, they don't know what you're going to be able to find in there. And I'm always amazed when I find a story that some government agency has in their data, and they don't realize it's there. They should be studying it as much as we are. It's management information basically. So anyway, push for those open records, push for open government, Freedom of Information Acts, go to court to fight it, and so on, which I know La Nation is leading the way on that kind of thing. You also need the right tools to do this, and that's the other kind of amazing thing that has gone on. When I first started doing this kind of work, very often I was having to type in information. I remember doing a story about murder in Miami. This is back in the days when Miami was the murder capital of the United States. We're number one. We had one year, it was something like 360 murders, almost the equivalent of a murder a day in Miami going on. And it was really, you weren't surprised anymore to read about a shootout in the street, cocaine cowboys, all these other things that were going on. So back then, when I wanted to do that story, I had to gather on paper all the information for all the murders over the course of the previous year, get it typed into a spreadsheet. I actually wound up hiring my then 14-year-old son to do all the typing. I gave him, what did I give him? Something like 10 cents per record to type it in. I will add that it apparently infected him with the idea of data journalism, because to his surprise and mine, he wound up actually becoming a reporter, and now he's the investigations editor for the Newsday newspaper in New York. He's pretty good with data, but he's actually smart enough to hire really good people. He hires really smart data journalists. So good tools, having not only the people who can do it, but the hardware. Well, every one of you who's working on a laptop is looking at a tool that is far, far more powerful than those mainframe computers I was using, for instance, to do the Hurricane Andrew story, and so on. I mean, we do not appreciate how wonderfully fast and powerful our machines are. In addition, we don't really appreciate how powerful the software we have available is, too. I mean, it's really amazing. When I first got my Atari 800, I used my skills in BASIC to write a program. It took me about a week to write this program to analyze the roll call votes in the legislature. To look at, not only how the two parties would split, but how North Florida versus South Florida, or male legislators versus female legislators, so on, what those splits were. And it would do it very quickly. But it took me a week to write this program. Today, of course, there's any number of off-the-shelf programs that you can immediately do this kind of analysis. You don't have to be a programmer to create this kind of power. So the power of being able to sort and filter and so on data, which is available through tools as simple as Excel. The power to map data using ArcMap or Google Fusion tables or things like that, to see the geographic pattern of your data. It tells you where the story is. That's an amazing kind of thing. The power to make interactive graphics that lets you not only see the overall patterns, but to see the, to give the reader the chance to explore the data themselves, to go in and do their own sorting of the data and so on. So you guys are living in a golden age. We definitely have gotten out of my dinosaur era, and now we are on the, really the edge of being able to do amazing things. This truly is the dawn of the big data era. We no longer think in terms of thousands of records. Sort of the biggest thing I personally have worked on involved the hospital records, where I was working with something like 50 million hospital admissions. I was doing it on a Mac Mini, little tiny Macintosh, sitting at home, going through and finding strong evidence of Medicare fraud by digging through these records. And as a taxpayer, not only as a reporter, I was great. As a taxpayer, I was angry because if I can sit there at home using this, small little computer and going through these publicly available records and find strong evidence of it, why wasn't the fraud unit of Medicare finding this same kind of stuff? Why were they not? Why were they allowing this to continue when the evidence was so strong? So to me, that's the amazing power that it lets even people as untrained and unprepared and so on as I was to be able to find this. Imagine what people who it's their job to find this kind of information could do. So I'm not going to talk a lot about big data. I'm actually going to dump that task on Alex. But I think I'm at the point of my talk. I've led you through my path to being able to do these things. As I say, it's a privilege for me not only to be here talking with you, but to see yet another example of how this concept, this idea of exploring data and using it to tell stories has spread, literally around the world. That this power isn't just for special people anymore. It's really opened it up to all of us. So we are at my other Spanish word. I think it may be Portuguese though. Perguntas? I'm not sure which. Okay, thank you.
Tenemos tiempo para 2 preguntas. O sea, los que levanten la mano primero, pasen si quieren acá. Vení, Gaba.
Thank you for your presentation, for the history you have on so much expertise. I'm wondering, yes, at the end you were saying that, yes, we have the tools now, and we have better ways to manage data. What are the challenges you think we have now? Because I feel that there are many challenges. We are still not there, so what do you feel are the challenges?
There we go. I got this on. I think it's working. Okay. The main challenge is the continual fight to get these records. Even with the passage of freedom of information laws and public records laws, that doesn't mean that the public officials necessarily understand it, that they feel that it applies to them or whatever. It's part of our job to make clear to public officials that the data that we are asking for is not their data, it's actually our data. It's our taxes that pay for it. We pay for it with the taxes. The other excuse I often hear is, we're too busy to do this kind of thing. We're doing our job and you're asking me to do something special. No, we aren't. Part of their job is to make the data available. And we need to get clear to them. They need to make it part of their job to do that. So I think that's the real challenge, the continual push to make even places where their public records laws are strong, even in the United States, and I know every reporter I talk to around the world says, oh, well, you're in the US where you call up and they immediately put it in a limousine and rush it over to you. That's not true. Okay. We often have to fight for it. We still often have to go to court and so on to do it. So I toss that to you as kind of the biggest challenge. The other challenge is going to be keeping up with the technology. Every day, new, more powerful kinds of tools come out to the point where you have so many choices. Don't be paralyzed by it. Don't worry that you have to have the most newest, most powerful thing. I mean, again, as a dinosaur, I'm still using the tools that I learned 20 years ago, even though arguably there are newer, more efficient and so on ways of doing some of the things that I do. In my case, I would rather work with the tools that I know. So again, don't feel like you have to keep up with everything that's going on in the technology. Muchas gracias.